Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CEFC Green Room on heavy fleet decarbonisation. Why am I here? I look after infrastructure investment at the CEFC, where my focus is on opportunities to reduce Scope 3 emissions of key infrastructure assets, such as ports and airports. And this work has led me to have a wider focus on the opportunities for heavy fleet electrification, given their interface with these kinds of assets. Today, we're going to share stories with our interesting group of panellists on their decarbonisation journey for heavy fleet. Before we start on those stories, I would first like to acknowledge the original storytellers on this land and to acknowledge that I am joining you from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. First, some housekeeping. Today's session will run for 45 minutes, followed by an opportunity for audience Q&A. Please submit your questions throughout via the Q&A button on your screen. We will try to get to as many of these as we can in the time available. And then a short survey at the end will also pop up. We'd appreciate it if you could take a minute to fill this out. The session is being recorded and you will receive a link afterwards. And now I'd like to introduce our interesting and impactful panellists who will talk about how they are tackling the transition challenge across a range of fleet, from trucks through to port handling fleet to a shore power for ships. First up is Heather Bone, Director of ESG at Team Global Express. Heather will talk about TGE's experience in introducing the largest electric truck fleet in Australia and the challenges of electrifying a depot. Second up, joining us from Adelaide is Keith Halifax, COO of Flinders Ports Holdings, who will talk to us about Flinders Ports' journey to identify ways to decarbonise and why electrification of ground fleet makes sense. And finally, Anna Manos, who heads Climateworks' Australian Country Context team, is joining us, where she works on a range of Climateworks Centre projects with a particular interest in policy. Anna is stepping in for Helen Rowe, who's unwell today. So some brief context setting. We will think, why are we looking at heavy transport? Why are we looking at fleet decarbonisation? So to the charts, if we look at the first chart, the teal section at the bottom shows how much energy in petajoules is used by the transport sector. This translates to around 20% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. Transport is going to be the largest source of emissions around the end of this decade. The second chart breaks this down so that we can see via the dark green portion on the left of that second chart that 56% of this energy consumption for transport is from diesel. Diesel is a key fuel to be eliminated in the heavy transport sector. What does this mean? We're entering a period where there will be a wholesale system change in the transport and fleet sector as it transitions from fossil fuels. This will be on a scale that is similar to what we have seen in the past decade with decarbonisation of the electricity industry. Today's focus is on what can be done now to start this transition via fleet electrification to reduce diesel usage. We are not discussing the other critical solutions that will also come into play over time, such as low carbon liquid fuel, sustainable aviation fuel, and hydrogen. So with all that in mind, I will now move to some questions for the panel, and we will start with Anna from Climateworks. Climateworks recently delivered the report Decarbonising Australia's Transport Sector, Diverse Solutions for a Credible Emissions Plan. Anna, could you start by sharing some of the key findings from this report for the heavy fleet industry?
Yeah, and apologies that technology difficulties means that it's better for me not to be on screen. Climateworks recently has actually done two relevant reports. So one is the diverse solutions, and we also did work last year specifically looking at decarbonising heavy vehicles, or decarbonising freight in general. I just wanted to do a bit of scene setting. I'm sure many people on the call know this, but transport is about 20% of Australia's total emissions. And although passenger emissions is the majority of that, 40% are from freight overall, and with the vast majority of that being road freight, bearing in mind these are domestic emissions. So road transport does have that largest share of freight emissions at over 80%. And road freight, therefore, is very important for the climate targets. And we found that that 40% is about 7% of Australia's total emissions. And most of that freight does include light commercial vehicles. But then if you want to go on to the next slide, but it is also this mix. So it's roads most important, but it's that mix of light and heavy. If you look here, that because other sectors are decarbonising faster, transport is set to be Australia's largest source of emissions, probably by the end of the decade. That's very apparent in places like ACT, where you've already got the electricity sector almost fully decarbonised. And this just shows you the different sectors within freight. And you can see that green chunk is heavy vehicles. And this work comes from the report we've just produced about diverse solutions. But this looks at if you only do technology, so you're just switching the vehicles themselves to low emissions, then this is the kind of change you get. And you're looking at sort of even heavy vehicles under a least cost pathway overall for the economy is needing to be around zero emissions, some shortly after 2045. Next slide, please. And so sort of what we found with the heavy vehicles was that its freight itself needs to start with the lighter ones and then move on to rigid trucks and then getting ready for those long haul options. And that's because for technologies, you've already got well developed options within both kind of light and medium duty. And then the heavy duty trucks, rail, domestic, maritime, those solutions aren't fully developed. They're not mature technologies. The other thing that we found was that one of the things that was important was that even with kind of heavy vehicles, it's how you integrate that freight with your kind of the last bit of delivery, those kind of last few miles. And so if you do that short haul, whether it's heavy or light, then that's where most of the solutions are available. And that's where some of the kind of optimizing, so not just talking about switching the vehicles themselves, but also looking at, how do your kind of intermodal shifts happen? What is happening when you're going from the kind of very heavy to the kind of being distributed around our cities? And that's also where those electric trucks and other options are already available. And then it's how to start the decarbonisation of the long haul now. So rather than, Australia waiting to see what happens, it's kind of start doing those piloting, which I'm sure we'll hear about right now, and start thinking about how you can integrate different modes and different kinds of fuels. And that is also that kind of mode shift, so going beyond road and getting onto rail. Next slide. Yeah, and then, one of the things we found was that transport is set to become a major user of electricity, as we know, because obviously as you switch from diesel to electricity, that increases substantially. And so one of the things we looked at within these diverse solutions was that if you do try and avoid some of the travel, you increase mode shift, you get 9% less electricity demand by 2050. And because you're already having to expand the system to electrify transport, then that kind of near 10% difference can really make a difference given how much we're already having to increase. So sort of by 2050, something like 24% of Australia's electricity demand is transport. So, you can see that exactly how that rolls out and how that gets sort of integrated into where electricity is being generated really matters. And apologies, I know that, sorry for the technology issues, and I know there's still a lag on this, but hopefully I can answer some of your questions around that.
Thanks, Anna. And I should have mentioned at the start, we haven't shown a picture of Anna because of her bandwidth at this present time. Thank you for those slides. And maybe we should start by kicking off with Heather. Congratulations on the success of Australia's first electric fleet depot at Bungarraby. We've heard you speak about the challenges and the successes of this depot construction. Can you tell us a bit more about the challenges of implementation and how the day-to-day operations are now going?
Sure, thanks, Julia. So you can see in the photo behind me quite a few of the trucks out on the depot floor. We've now received our 60th truck, so we are completely operational now. That's 36 Volvos and 24 Fuso e-canters. But I have to say it's been a really tough journey. It really has. And if you think about, as Anna touched upon, that you can either change the technology, your propulsion method, or you can change your energy type, being your fuel type. What we have achieved at Bungarraby is probably the cheapest and easiest option that you could think of at this point in time. Having said that, while it's the easiest option, it's been really, really hard to do. We've had challenges all over the place, and I think it's fair to say that the learnings that we're getting out of this trial are immeasurable. They really are. And even, as of this morning, I get messages from some of the drivers saying the charger hasn't worked, the truck hasn't charged over the weekend. The integration of this into the rest of the facility has been really, really challenging to do. And that's just the basics, Julia. I think when we start to try and optimize that, we're going to have all other things go wrong as well at the same time. So if you think about it, we're just at the tipping point, the very tipping point of getting these 60 trucks to go and do what we're asking them to do. And it's going to take another 6 or 12 months before we can finally start learning from it and optimizing what we're doing on site. So it's a fantastic facility, but it's got a long, long way to go, is probably fair to say.
Thank you. And maybe now, I think thinking about the challenges and the length of time involved in those, Keith, if we pivot from trucks to other heavy fleet, Flinders Ports has been looking to electrify some of its ground operations at the port. Can you talk us through your approach, including challenges so far and where you see potential early wins at the port, recognising where you're at on your journey at this stage?
Thanks, Julia. Hello all. Yeah, slightly, I guess, a unique challenge in a port context. And for those who aren't so familiar with Flinders, we are a highly operating port compared to our cousin and peers in the other capital cities. So what I mean by that is we've got a higher operational role inside the port precinct. So we actually are a container terminal operator as well as other landside and warehousing businesses. And so what that means is actually our ability and our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are probably greater than that we see in the other capital ports. And that poses the challenges of higher heavy plant equipment like cranes, straddle carriers, right through to reach stackers, empty container handlers, and then down into your smaller fleets like forklifts and the like. I think for us, for Flinders, it's really recognising, I think the important work that we did before we went too far was to really understand the scale of the problem. If you get a really good handle on where your carbon is being emitted, and then therefore can start to work through how you can influence and control that through the life cycle reinvestment of those assets, that's how you can start to practicalise or really put into practice the investment decisions necessary to ultimately transition your entire operation to net zero. I think for us, and I think part of Flinders' journey has really been recognising the importance of the 1%, the 10%, the 15%. So it's really understanding that I think sometimes we can all be a little bit guilty of wanting to jump right to the end game. Must be net zero, must be fully electrified. And in some instances, that will be the transition. You will see an absolute mode shift where you go from a diesel piece of equipment to a fully electrified. And certainly something that Flinders is looking at the moment is that in terms of how we operate the landside mode of our container terminal, for example. A move from a diesel or a hybrid powered straddle carrier through to a fully electrified crane. But then when you start to look for your other heavy fleets, and it can be trucks, it could be, as I said, heavy forklifts or other pieces of heavy plant, it's really recognising that, you know, a 25% or 30% improvement in that carbon emission is a meaningful impact to your carbon budget. And so that actually allows you to start playing through the journey here and really starting to I guess, ultimately save now and utilise those credits for the longer term journey. And another great example for us is we also operate all of the pilotage function in South Australia. So that's 15 to 20 vessels out there on the water burning diesel as they stand at the moment. But as our reinvestment cycle is happening now, we're looking to construct vessels that we know will be able to accommodate those future propulsion systems. So we're building we're basically taking larger vessels that we know we'd be able to put in an engine that would be able to take that ultimate fuel. So I think for me, Julia, or for us, it's really been, how can you take advantage of the technology that presents you now and actually start to get those kind of 15, 20, 30% improvements. And then as the technology becomes available, that allow you to start making even bigger inroads, then you take advantage of that at the time.
Hey, Julia, there's a couple of questions in there that we can answer fairly quickly before you throw to the next question. So from Summer Fox, what's the definition of heavy vehicles in this? Yes, it is 4.5 tonne and above. And for Philip Watts about our electric trucks. So yeah, Team Global Express is a very large intermodal business. We have 6,000 or so trucks, and these 60 specifically go around metropolitan distribution satchels. We are starting to get heavier loads in them, but they tend to be around about a 50-kilometre zone in the Sydney metropolitan area. Just thought I'd answer that quickly while you were thinking, Julia.
No, that's great. That's very helpful. And I do apologise if there's any lags being experienced by the audience as well. Thank you, Keith, for that too. And I think there's a critical point in there about starting with what you can. What are the early wins? What makes sense? You know, if addressing ground fleet at the port is less than 10% of your total Scope 3 emissions, or does it actually matter? It's good if you've got solutions that you can put in place now and start thinking about. That's not a bad thing. And I was thinking along the lines of that, whether you see, Keith, your key customers such as shipping lines and freight and logistics companies seeking to address fleet decarbonisation, or is that too far off and down the track for you?
No, it's definitely happening now, Julia. And I think right through the end-to-end of a supply chain. So just as much as we're seeing it from vessels who, for context, are of our total emissions, about 90% is in that Scope 3 bucket, and the vast majority of that would be from the vessels themselves. A very, very difficult challenge for them to decarbonise. I think in their own right, they'd be as big an emitter globally as something like the 5th or 6th largest country in the world, such as the significance of that vessel fleet globally. And at the moment, the biggest challenge in that industry has been an absence of standards in terms of either a fuel type that the industry is exploring, or if you come to something which we might talk about a bit later around shore-based power and the electrification supply to those vessels when they're alongside a berth. Again, no global standard in terms of, it's almost the plug that gets put into these. And I think it's always interesting, just for a bit of context, a bit of a fun fact that, if you have a cruise ship that's alongside, the energy requirement for a cruise ship in 24 hours would dwarf a small Pacific nation's country's power requirement for a year, right? Such is the size and scale of these floating cities. So I think in that regard, Julia, we're absolutely hearing it from all ends of the supply chain. And I think for me, in the last 12 to 18 months, what we've really seen in Flinders is that need to understand their end, a cargo owner's end-to-end supply chain or a freight forwarder's end-to-end supply chain. They are now really considering the decarbonisation as a value across that chain, and it is starting to influence decision making. I don't think we've yet got to the point where people are absolutely placing everything on that decision, but they're certainly asking more questions and wanting to understand how, as a trade facilitator or an infrastructure provider, how are we really supporting their end-to-end emissions throughput. And I think it's not going to be long, obviously, before a value is really placed in real terms on what a emissions output across that end-to-end is going to mean for a customer, and that starts to get priced into contracts. And I think that will be undoubtedly the point where you really start to see industry shift. Because at the moment, I guess you're still at that pressure point of when does a customer pay for that premium? When does a customer pay for that additional cost of investment that comes with meeting the decarb provision of service today?
Thanks, Keith. And I mean, thinking along those lines, Heather, have you seen the customers' view of this electrification adding to your value or TGE's value proposition to their customers? So, going from the momentum of starting the Bungarabie depot and making a big play, saying this is going to be how this depot operates, we're not just doing a trial. Have you noticed a change in your customer response to that, and how they're, is it a positive one, and how are they taking that?
Yeah, it's been a really big shift for our customers to even consider how much this is going to impact on the cost to serve. We have certain brands that we work with all the time who are really keen to use the electric vehicles, but these EVs are in a network business. So the reason why their cost to serve, or our cost to serve, is low is because they're in a network business. If they were dedicated fleet for dedicated customers, then the pricing would be very different, I would have said. And if you think back to maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the customers have been very open about not wanting to pay for this. They don't want to pay for decarbonisation. But the conversation is now changing. I think the questions are now being asked, okay, so if we do want to decarbonise, what exactly is that going to cost as an end consumer? And these trucks, look at the total cost of ownership of these trucks, they're more than double a diesel truck. And that cost has to go somewhere. We're very lucky in this instance because we have the ARENA grant that supports that difference in TCO, in total cost of ownership, which means that we don't have to pass the additionality on to the consumer. But we're definitely seeing some changes. And I thought also I might just be really rude and answer some of the questions that are coming through as well, because Rick, you put in a great question. So this facility already had 400 kilowatts of solar at the site. We then were able to optimise the 2 main switchboards and the distribution routes so that we didn't have to put in a further substation and therefore impact the grid. We do have a 1 megawatt battery, so we're able to optimise it and start to play with the pricing, once we have the trucks all moving. But you then asked how cooperative have the distribution companies been? And I think that's really a telling question, because we were able to do this without having to worry about the impact on the DNSPs. Interestingly, just this morning, we've had a request from Endeavour Energy for 25 of their board members and executives to come out and have a look at the site. So you can see that they're really interested in it. Ben, and just to cover off about bidirectional charging, that is absolutely the way of the future. The way that we have set this up is so that we can think about using these trucks effectively as a battery to feed back into the grid, which means that we've, in putting in the charging network, we had to make sure that there's no distortion through harmonics back into the grid, and some of these more technical things that I'm sure we're not here to answer.
in the spirit of answering some questions, Julia, there's a couple here that I'm happy to jump in similar to here. There's, well, I think, and I might just pick up on a couple of what Heather just said as well. So I think there's absolutely, in the sense of electrical infrastructure, I think there was a question here around the challenges of that, and I think this is going to be something that Australia will face, that the demand profile for electricity will go nuclear. Well, bad choice of word. It's going to go exponentially higher. Obviously, when we start to look into the full electrification of fleets of assets like these, and if the demand profiling that we've just done on ourselves, if I wanted to start looking, or when we start looking at providing shore power to vessels like cruise ships, like container vessels, these sorts of things, the demand is so much higher than we're providing, and the electrical infrastructure near our facilities has got nowhere near the capacity to provide that. And so that's one of the journeys that has to be walked hand in hand here to make sure that that electrical infrastructure is going to be there to provide this level of power. And secondly, obviously, and most importantly, that power is being provided green. So there'd be no sense in providing electrification if we're then just going to be putting dirty electricity into that grid. So it's also about making sure that that goes hand in hand. But that does lead to other sorts of innovation that can be done around behind the meter, microgrids, solar, all of these sorts of things. We have a lot of equipment that can actually energy generate in its use. Obviously, as cranes are lowering, that actually it can store its own energy and repurpose that. So there's a lot of things here around that. I think Nick has raised a question around in terms of what other fuels. Vast array, everything from green methanol through to hydrogen, through to other things are being explored. Then I think you've just got low sulfur fuels, which we're also starting to get into there now. So there's lots of different things. And I think that's the challenge, is that ports are being asked to consider how they would bunker and how they would support fleets of vessels on multiple fuel types. And the brutal reality is you can't bunker multiple fuels at every berth that operates. So until there is a little bit more consistency in a global industry setting around shipping, it's going to be really tough to really narrow down and support concepts like green corridors, concepts like shore-based power. And I think the last one I think I saw here was just which is probably a personal favourite of mine, is around the metrics used for decision making on analysis. I mean, that I could talk for the next 45 minutes on that alone. It's and I'm a bit of a simpleton when it comes to this, and I think we have long established investment decision making practices in corporate business. I think the key for decarbonisation is it has to be considered in those contexts. So our traditional metrics of IRR, NPV, the return on invested capital, these are all the metrics that need to be used to answer for this. It's just that those investment rationales need to start to consider and place ultimately dollars on carbon. And I think until we can start, I think there's more maturity coming in that space. Certainly something that Flinders, it's not just about having an internal carbon price, it's about looking at that over time. So it's one thing to, we set a $25 carbon price now, but what's going to be the cost of offsets later if you choose to not be a good emitter and you choose to have to try and find your offset from a decarb target somewhere else. Those prices are only going to grow. And so it's really about considering that in your normal investment metrics. I think that's going to be the key to every industry here. And I think that's how you'll start to overcome that cost premium that might come with investing in a new age technology. So that's probably done for a few questions there. I'll hand you back, Julia.
No, I love it. There's been a heap of questions, so it's great. And I mean, thinking along that theme, Keith, that also, do you see the potential for your ports to be a host to common user infrastructure to help enable port users to decarbonise? Because a port has so many interfaces with the transport world. Obviously shore power is kind of the first one that comes to mind out of that. But and thinking, as we've got a theme sort of around heavy fleet electrification, do you see opportunities where you could be a host of maybe charging infrastructure that could be used by other fleet using the port?
I'm glad you asked the second question, Julia, because I was probably going to start there first. I think I've probably outlined here some of the challenges with shore power. Firstly, to answer your question, ports are common user infrastructure. We are facilitators of cargo, and for Australia in particular, as an island nation and as a heavy, international trader, it's the unique advantage, I guess, ports have is they become a natural node for trade. They become a natural congruence to where supply chains end up, particularly freight. And so I very much see ports having a very active role in supporting decarbonisation of supply chains, because you're going to have a lot of that freight turn up at the door. So whether that's coming from the seaside and its vessels, absolutely it's our role to support common user infrastructure like shore-based power, like green fuel bunkering where it's relevant. But I'm actually just as interested on the land side. So again, rail infrastructure tends to end at an intermodal facility or a port. And equally, every truck, in South Australia in particular, every truck that has a container on it is coming to our facility. So I think we have a very important role to play, that we know that all of those trucks are going to present at our port. How can we provide the staging infrastructure to allow them to be charged, to allow them to refuel? And if I was to broaden into other aspects of ESG, how do we provide that structure around the social element to drivers and their safety and all of that sort of good stuff as well? So no, I think the provision of common user infrastructure, the use of regulatory models, the use of those sorts of mechanisms as well are all very helpful for how we can actually support right across the supply chain. And I think the important thing for larger handlers like TGE and Ever and like ourselves, you've also got to remember there's a vast array in Australia of very small operators who might have one truck, who might only have a small number of trucks. So they're not going to have the capital behind them to go investing in technology early, like the bigger businesses can. And again, I think that therefore places more onus and responsibility even on those larger players to provide infrastructure that all can play in. And again, I think that's where port and terminals have a role to play here as well.
Yep. And maybe thinking about that, Heather, in line with TGE's operations, is that something you would be looking for? And maybe that's a bit of a broad question, but that use of common user infrastructure where it's needed. Obviously, you've got depots around the country and a significant presence, but is that something that you see of value to a fleet like TGE's, or do you see that more playing out for other parties who might not have the same opportunity with depots that TGE might?
Sorry, there's a few different parts to this to break down, and I'd also there's a few questions popping around that hopefully I'll answer the questions well. Rob, just first up, when you say it was clearly a painful journey, you know what? It's been an amazing journey. I absolutely have loved every minute of this, because we've just learnt so much. And what it's also seen is the courage for our drivers to really step up and do something different has just been wonderful in that journey. So I probably shouldn't say it's been a painful journey. When it comes to access to infrastructure, though, I think what we have to bear in mind is that electric trucks and electric vehicles are going to be appropriate for certain parts of the industry. They're not going to be for everyone. There's going to be renewable diesel, there's going to be hydrogen down the line and all of that sort of stuff. But today's focus is on the EV. But it's not for everyone. So it makes sense in certain applications at the moment for us, where the trucks are parked up overnight and they get charged overnight. Having said that, a number of the trucks, in fact, quite a few of them, don't have to be charged overnight because they're not going far enough during the day to warrant being plugged in. So what I've been pushing back on my team is, well, let's flip that on its head. Let's make sure that they're always going out at 100%, because we need to optimise the use of the energy overnight when it's really low. We have to think of this as a total energy management system rather than trucks and chargers. So I would say we've got a journey ahead of us around more public infrastructure. And I think that we have to come at that from two positions. So one is from a CapEx and one is from an OpEx perspective. We came at this one from a capitally, very capitally intensive. But what's happening with a number of the public infrastructure projects, from what I can see, is they're having to price access to that infrastructure from a capital cost rather than from an operational cost. I can't afford for my trucks to go out on the road and spend 60 or 70 or 80 cents a litre or per kilowatt of energy. That just doesn't stack up from an operational perspective. So I think what we're going to find is a bit of a split in the industry between options like ours, where we have everything going back to the grid at night, and options where we have to figure out how to bring down the cost of that carbon, the operational cost as well. And if I can just ask, there was a couple of other, Gary Wyatt, yes, so ARENA, essentially the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, we applied for a very large grant, and so the total cost of this project is about $45 million. About 21 of that million is through an ARENA grant. We would not be able to have done this without that ARENA grant. And now what we're also doing is working with the CFC to get some more concessional style finance in order for us to do other things as well. And then there was a question about how long do they try. Sometimes, as I said, they're not necessarily taking a huge amount of time to charge. We've got both slow chargers and fast chargers. So we've got 47 slow chargers out the back here, and we've got 16 fast chargers out the front. So if one of the drivers comes in and needs to top up during the day, they can go to the fast charger at the front, and it's right next to the cafeteria. So it's a pretty good outcome. Ben, oh, hey, Ben, nice to see you. And yes, we can already use our stationary battery to feed back into the grid, absolutely, assuming it's the same Ben that I think it is. So the first hour that we turned our battery on, that site has really peaky troughs and peaks. That might go up by, I remember one time, the peak was anticipated to be 9,800% higher in that particular hour, which was at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, coming into, everyone was turning on the air conditions, that sort of thing. So what we did was we turned on the battery to utilise it, and we saved ourselves about $17,000 within the space of about an hour. And Greg McGarvey, nice to see you as well. I also saw there was an Oz EV article that I was reading just this morning about Ford's getting utes, into Australia, which is pretty cool. The pushback that we've had, the pushback hasn't been from the OEMs or the chargers or anything like that. The pushback has been a bit more day-to-day, and there have been things like drivers being concerned that their bottom might be on fire because they're worried about thermal runaway in a truck. So we've spent a huge amount of time working with our drivers to make sure that they're comfortable in the sorts of things we're doing. But I hope I've answered a few quick questions in there as well, Julia. It's fascinating to watch these questions come through at the same time.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions coming through, and it's great. So keep coming on that front. Anna, I haven't forgotten about you, even though we can't see you. Just a question for you from a policy perspective. I know it's early days, but have you seen anything overseas that could be useful here to help enable this transition of the transport sector? Or have you seen policies in other sectors, such as the energy sector, that could be sort of repurposed in a way to assist this? Over to you.
So, I'll start with, what is important to note is that Australia probably is a bit slow in this area. And although we have some transport that is quite unique, so, or road transport that's quite unique, road trains, we also have other areas that are, pretty similar to both the US and EU. And you can see that there are already existing solutions in rigid trucks, as, it's been discussed already. And but we do need some more nationally consistency. So, regulations, what kind of access. And one of the things I'd note is, there are those issues about weight limit changes. Now that's starting to happen, but some of that's still at that pilot stage. So we need that national consistency around what vehicles are allowed on our roads and how does that relate to, what vehicles are available internationally, because, we are technology takers for most vehicles. And also already been mentioned is the number of kind of small businesses and owner operators around of heavy vehicles. And that's quite different. The proportion of that is quite different in Australia. So how do you fund those kind of smaller operators to be able to change? I would note that both the EU and the US do have heavy vehicle emission standards that are sort of coming in. So, I think most people on the call will know that Australia, from, start sort of now in legislation, but starting next year, will have light vehicle fuel efficiency or emission standards. But those are also extending it globally to heavy vehicles, but the government hasn't been prepared to go down that route as yet. And really, in Climateworks, we do see heavy vehicle standards as important. But I'd also, it is that thing about, given that it's not fully clear what kinds of technologies are the best bet, we need to do some experimenting, really, some pilots about what does work in Australia. Would hydrogen work? As we're starting to see hydrogen be produced in Australia, and people may know that the National Hydrogen Strategy was released last week, and there are some moves towards green hydrogen production onshore. As you see that kind of supply of those vehicles, is that the alternative? Well, until we do a lot more experimentation, I think it's not clear. And, it's great to have Heather talking about her experience. And that's what we need to see what works, what are the barriers, and therefore where does government need to step in?
Thank you, Anna. And I think this convergence of things, the energy sector, the transport sector, and policy are something. Policy and transport and policy and energy have often been tied up with each other, but less so the electricity sector and the transport sector, unless you're talking about public transport by trains in cities. And I think this new sort of interface and cooperation across the two sectors is something that's probably emerging and will be more important as this transition goes on and the volumes in transport get to critical masses. I just was interested to hear whether maybe start with Keith, if you're seeing this play out at all so far in your discussions. Do you have discussions? I mean, you've got your own grid, so you're in a different position, but are you ready? Is there some sort of interface or regular way you're connecting with the power sector on this, or is it too early for that?
No, it's happening as we speak to you already. So probably two comments. I think one, I think you just made a really important point, and I think Heather also spoke to that. Obviously, part of the reason they were able to commercially do what they've done has been the support of ARENA and other kind of grant funding. I think there naturally is always going to be a play for, I think, private-public partnerships to really demonstrate technology at scale here to support industry growth. So I think that comment is well made. In terms of how we're partnering, absolutely. So we're actually involved in a number of organisations. I think South Australia generally is fairly progressive when it comes to net zero and particularly around the energy sector. So we're involved in a number of kind of consortium groups that are really looking to take some of the challenges of that on. So there's like a net zero group, I think it's SA0, I think is the name of it officially, that involves a number of partners, both government and private, in terms of exploring not only how do we power the grid, how does it meet the growing demand being required of it, and then obviously how does that energy get provided to it as well. So that's super important. And I think the other thing I'd say is also the collaboration that's starting to happen in industry as well. So again, I'll pick up on shore power again, just as another good example. you've got the first couple of instances of that shown in, say, New South Wales. Public investment. So that's government investment in order to support that case. A very dedicated vessel, a very dedicated berth. But I guess obviously there are learnings to be had for the journey that's been operated there, that we're starting to obviously understand how they've done it, the challenges they've faced, and then can learn that into the next project and the next project and the next project. And obviously, just given the beautiful distances that you have between ports and cities in Australia, there is probably less, there's much more openness and collaboration around these sorts of things than I think you get inside Europe or you get inside the US, where those ports are far more competitive, or those counterparties are far more competitive. So I think that's, again, another thing that Australia is going to demonstrate, an ability to collaborate wider because those kind of dynamics are there.
I've still got you, Keith. There's a question from Pascal Petit. With the lack of decarbonisation standards for propulsion and energy type for port infrastructure in some countries Australia trades with, negatively affect trade volume, and how can this be overcome to ensure trade continues during the energy transition?
I saw Pascal's question. That is an awesome question. And I don't know, express probably a personal view. Yes, I think it does. I think what you're starting to see is some particular countries and Australia start to talk about concepts like shipping corridors and green corridors, where shipping lines, if you're an MSC or a Maersk or a Hapag-Lloyd, CMA, it doesn't really matter. They've all got very big challenges to overcome when it comes to decarbonisation. So they are exploring all options for how they do that. Port-to-port bunkering of fuels, knowing certain ports are going to be able to provide them with the energy and support for them to meet their end commitments is absolutely, I think, going to dictate how shipping lines will run. And that will dictate how those trade corridors are created. And that will certainly change, I think, the end-to-end supply chain. So ultimately, if you've got an active market willing to buy Australian product in North America, it'll find its way there. But potentially how it navigates the world to get there, I think, will be subject to change. And I think you're starting to see shifts already in Australia around those trade routes. I think MSC cancelled services only, I think, as of this month. Former services have kind of been cancelled out of, say, North Asia and repivoted. And for sure, part of that is starting to think about how they are doing things the most fuel efficient way, the most optimization of their own fleets in order to meet that. So do I think these customers, I think there's another one here, I think that I've seen James raise around, do I think customers are going to be willing to pay premiums? In time, it'll just become the market. I think in the interim, yes, I think you'll find some will be willing to. And I've been noting down a couple of questions that also came up, which some really awesome questions around. I mean, SA hydrogen, will SA be an exporter of hydrogen? Probably in the future, yes. A very long-term game. That one, wind turbines on ships, very a bit of a new technology. Interesting in terms of height. It puts a lot of height on vessels. That's going to create other operational challenges, I think, for those vessels. But definitely, depending on the trade route, is an option. And the other point, I think it was the question was targeted at Heather, but I think I really like the point that was made, or the question made, around how important transparency and reporting will be for changing behaviour. Again, I believe that is going to be absolutely one of those triggers that companies in their annual reports over the next kind of couple of years, as they become grouped in entities to put that information public, that is going to be a driver of activity because your behaviour is going to be out there in the marketplace. And I think that's where you will start to see companies start to place more value, as I said earlier, on those need to invest in decisions and in reinvestment cycles that push them along this journey, because you won't be able to hide anymore. So thank you, Julia. Great question.
Yeah, and I think that's a really relevant question. I wouldn't mind throwing that over to Heather as well to see what your views are about that increasing reporting, that increasing transparency about your carbon footprint. what that's doing to your customer behaviours, and are you seeing the impacts of that already, and where do you see that heading?
I think it's a terrific thing for the industry as a whole, because it hopefully will mean that we're starting to play on a level playing field with everyone else. I do worry that the first couple of years we'll see larger entities, perhaps putting a price on carbon because they're having to report for it. It'll be interesting to see if procurement then takes that, that decision down to smaller entities who can charge a lower margin, in an industry that has such low margins to start off with. So I would hate to see that the ISSB turns out being a race to the bottom in pricing. It really should be a race to enhance the decarbonisation. So fingers crossed that's going to happen. But I'd also say, to go back to your early comment, Julia, if we don't collaborate as an industry, and I do mean that across the industry between transport modes and infrastructure and energy and our end consumer, if we don't start collaborating in the most positive manner, we are simply not going to be able to get to where we need to get to. And that's why I think it is so critical for entities such as ARENA, such as the CEFC, to be supporting these decarbonisation journeys, because I frankly think it's not going to happen in the absence of that. So, I think kudos to, yes, Australia does tend to lag the world when it comes to a lot of these things, but at least now we have a much better policy framework in which to operate, and we've got entities like ARENA and the CEFC that we can share that journey with.
Thank you. Maybe Anna too, I think.
You can pay me later for the part on the CEFC.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something around, this discussion that as those mandatory disclosures come into force, and particularly, once the scope 3 emissions start to be accounted for with sort of, companies such as Woolworths, then there will be more of a focus on what's happening with freight. And so you will start to see how, emissions from the freight industry, and it won't necessarily be when they're being disclosed, sort of the few big freight companies that have to disclose, but it's that kind of, as smaller companies get picked up through those scope 3 emissions, I think it'll be very interesting to see what kind of pressure there then is to decarbonise. And perhaps that's when some of our investors will also sort of start to do some more concessionary finance. So beyond the CEFC, wonderful though they are, but once, the rest of the private sector gets involved, it'll be interesting to see whether that does help, some of the smaller operators decarbonise, or whether it's all, because you don't want mandatory disclosure to be all about just pressure showing who's dirty. You want it to then be able to unlock investment in what's cleaner. And so it will be, I'll be looking for that as those scope 3 emissions start to be compulsory as well. And, I also was interested in that kind of discussion about how transport and the energy sector need to really get a lot closer. Because I think, some of the freight distribution centres are like, they are really huge. And so they can operate as those kind of generator charger sort of locations as well. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops and how that potentially could prevent some of the kind of more remote generation that you need if you have it happening in that kind of outer suburban area.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we've got quite a few questions in here. So I was just trying to think about how to tie that into the next one. There's an interesting one about coastal shipping, Keith. I don't know if you want to think about that one, a role for shifting to coastal shipping as decarbonisation opportunities increase, or and fossil fuels disappear. That might be a bit of a longer dated thing. We've always struggled a bit with coastal shipping in Australia, but
yeah, we have. It's waxed and waned, the old coastal shipping debate. Look, and it never goes away. And I think it naturally is dependent on the products and the commodity that's being moved, and ultimately it comes down to sheer economics at the end of the day. It's but as I said, also what will be interesting, I think, is when I talk about sheer economics, when that actually starts to consider decarbonisation in them. Will that be a game changer for supporting some need for domestic coastal shipping? Probably. At the moment, it doesn't stack, but I think that is certainly something that will come. Also, when I say it doesn't stack, I mean in certain industries and certain commodity types, we see it a fair bit. And actually, ironically, in energy is one, gas is one where you see that get moved around the country that way. But obviously, I think what will become important is obviously the scale and size of parcel loads that can be achieved by shipping is very large, obviously. Comparing that to an equivalent cost of decarb considered for rail or truck across the country, yeah, those scales can tip. So I think it'll be one that it'll never go away. I think that's one that will constantly be a potential mode of operation, and if the market environment's right, it'll end up winning. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Julia, if I can just chip in there a little bit, and it's around the potential for distortion in the market. So, we have two ships that go back and forth between the mainland and Tasmania. When they are in port, so effectively they're coastal shipping, when they're in port, they cold iron, they hook up to shore power. And that makes sense if that shore power is renewable energy. But if that shore power is still brown coal from Loy Yang, it's distorting the market rather than decarbonising. So, when the ships are down in Burnie, Tasmanian energy is so much more renewable focus compared to Melbourne. And I think that there are going to be certain industries who will be the last one standing because the electrification of their fleet is just going to be so hard to do. And by that, I'm actually thinking about the concrete agitators who are, they need to keep that bowl spinning over and over in order for the concrete to be at the right, mix when they get to a site. They don't stop, right? The trucks back up under the sock, they get their next load and off they go. So there's no real time for a concrete agitator to be plugged in and electrified. So I think there's just going to be parts of the freight industry that are laggards because they're really, really hard to deal with. And that's why I think things like renewable diesel are going to have to come to the fore as quickly as we possibly can, because electrification isn't going to be for everyone in this race.
And I think we've got, that's a pretty close to valid point to end up on. We've got time maybe just for one more of the questions in the list. And I think we had one on the taxonomy, will the sustainable finance taxonomy help encourage investments?
Can I throw into that one, because I'm helping on the taxonomy with ASFI, with the Sustainable Finance Institute. And I have been fascinated all the way through about this absolute focus on electrification. It's in not coming so much from the Australians, but international focus on electrification, which for in Australia is just not going to be the case for a long time to come. We're not going to be electrifying planes anytime soon. We're not necessarily going to have electric ships. I think the taxonomy is going to be a really interesting journey to follow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd add about, that with the taxonomy, what is interesting is that it really does point out, if it's designed well, it points out two things. So one is the cleanest, what is in line with a 1.5 degree temperature limit, but also it's, what can be funded to get that transition, but whilst understanding that transition has to be genuine. It's not kind of paying for a small incremental change that you then don't do anything about kind of further down the line. So I think the taxonomy will be incredibly powerful. I think it will be interesting to see how the Australian one relates kind of internationally, because although we have different challenges, Obviously, most of our finance does come from overseas. So, what the international investment market thinks matters. And so there's a real balance. And, it's the sort of biofuels and alternative diesels is very interesting for Australia because there's so much pressure on our land use that, whether or not there will, how much biofuels can be produced here of what kinds is a big unknown, as much as the kind of what sort of heavy vehicles will we have in the future, because it's not just about kind of electric versus others, it's what kind of batteries, because that is what kind of batteries is starting to evolve much more quickly than say a decade ago. So there's lots of interesting technology questions to come.
I see we're on time, so I'm going to have to cut you off there, but I would like to thank you all, the three panelists, Anna, Keith and Heather. You've done a great job, and the audience, thanks for all your interest and many questions. It's been really good to have such a live feed going on. Hopefully we've left you with something to reflect on. We've heard that addressing diesel now is key. It can be across different fleet. It can be fleet at ports or ground service equipment at airports. It might be trucks, and it may only end up being a small portion of the total solution, but it's something that can happen now. It's the low-hanging fruit. There's a significant amount of collaboration and interface involved to come, and we're just at the start, and all solutions are going to be needed. But yeah, thanks again for your time and for the panelists.